In the spring of 1639, a woman named Maria de la Encarnacion was taken to trial by the Holy Inquisition in Madrid. Maria was becoming famous around the city, especially for going into raptures and ecstatic visions during Mass or when she saw an image of Christ. The Inquisition was called to intervene. During her trial, many of Maria's relatives and neighbors were called as witnesses. They describe a vibrant woman of 28 who liked to dress up and look good. More than that, they describe Maria as someone who craved for attention. One of the ways that she got noticed was by wearing a Guardainfante. When her neighbors and relatives referred to this specific garment, alarms went on in the minds of the inquisitors. Now, this leads us to two questions. What on earth is a Guardainfante? And why did inquisitors have such a strong and negative reaction to the fact that Maria was often spotted wearing one? Hello, my name is Andre and welcome back to my channel. So, first things first, what is a Guardainfante? For this video, I will use the studies of the American historian Amanda Wunder, amongst others, so if you are interested, you can check the sources that I use on the description below. A Guardainfante is a farthingale-like structure used during the 17th century. I am using the word farthingale as a broad expression to refer to any garment that was used in the early modern period to give a particular shape or volume to women's skirts. Unfortunately, I cannot show you an image of a Guardainfante because none of them survive and there are no iconographic representations of it. What paintings from the time can show is the effect that wearing the Guardainfante would give to the female silhouette, but not the aspect of the garment itself. But we do have textual descriptions, however. The Guardainfante was described as a cage-like structure composed of hoops connected with straps, which is a departure from the previously worn Spanish farthingale, which was composed of a skirt with concentric hoops sewn on. The hoops of the Guardainfante tied around the waist, creating a hollow, bell-like structure. On top of that, several layers of petticoats would create a padded and smooth surface. Worn by royalty and aristocrat, as well as common women, in the streets of Spain, Portugal, and even in the Americas, the Guardainfante became a symbol of Spanish identity and of female audacity. The origins of the Guardainfante are still obscure. Spanish costume historian Carmen Bernish suggested that the Guardainfante could have originated in French theater groups performing in Madrid in the early 1630s. Bernish theorized that the actors would perform on stage wearing the French farthingale, which, unlike its ancestor, the Spanish farthingale, which was still worn in Spain, concentrated the volume around the waist, creating a drum-like shape. But by the early 1630s, the French farthingale was terribly out of fashion, so I assume that the actors wore it on stage to signal an elderly character or most likely for comedic reasons. But the Spanish ladies felt inspired by it. Notice that the French farthingale was never adopted in the south of Europe. Spain, Portugal, and some parts of Italy used the Spanish farthingale, known in the Iberian Peninsula as a verdugan. In most literature, especially English, Spanish fashion in the early 17th century is often described as outdated, stiff, and weird. The truth is that, in the second half of the 16th century, Spanish fashion dominated the courts and the streets of Europe. This period of strong Spanish influence in costume coincided with the zenith of the Spanish Empire. But in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Spain, although still immensely powerful and influential, was entering a period of political, financial, and dynastic crisis. Other European nations moved away from the Spanish style, creating new and original fashions. Spain could have adopted these new fashions, but that's not what happened. Instead, it went on the opposite direction, indulging on its own aesthetic and pushing it to the extreme. Spanish fashion became more rigid, more structured, and more artificial than ever. But this sense of independence was probably its most defining characteristic. Throughout the 17th century, Spanish fashion was able to maintain its own originality, making it a symbol of Spanish identity and an instrument of Spanish politics. As we will see, the Habsburg rulers of Spain used fashion as a key element of their politics, both domestically and abroad. But what does this all mean in terms of clothes? In this portrait from about 1603, you can see how Spanish fashion looked like in the early 17th century. It shows Ana de Velasco y Girón, a Spanish aristocrat, who was represented following the Spanish ideal of feminine beauty. The silhouette is extremely stylized and artificial. The body is completely hidden by the clothes. The torso is smooth and bears no sign of her breasts. Breasts were not fashionable during this time period in Spain. Later accounts even reference the practice of binding the breasts of young girls in order to prevent them from growing. Something surprising, since if we look at the art produced during this time period, curves and full-figured women were the norm. But most of these paintings and sculptures were produced by men, for men. So this was more of a male ideal, a male fantasy. It's hard to understand if flat chests were imposed by men or a choice by women. To finish off her look, Anna wore a rough collar known as a lechuguilla. The lechuguilla first appeared in the reign of Philip II, and with time it only grew in size and cost. By the reign of Philip III in the early 17th century, the collar had grown so much that now it needed its own support system to keep it in place, being worn by both men and women. According to Amanda Wunder, the use of the rough collars, especially by men, was associated with the decline of the Spanish Empire. They were expensive, sometimes demanding dozens of meters of linen, hard to maintain, and seen as effeminate and passive. Overall, the male ruff became a symbol of the excesses, corruption, and decadence of the Spanish Empire during the reign of Philip III. Something had to change, and it did when Philip's son rose to the throne as Philip IV. The young king was looking for a way to distance himself from the reign of his father, and he saw in the rough collar the perfect opportunity. In February of 1622, rough collars were outlawed for men. As a replacement, the new law ordered the use of the valona, a flat collar used at the base of the neck with origins in the military world. Women were allowed to continue using the rough collar, although with no extra decorations and never larger than 7 centimeters. In the weeks following the publication of the new law, men were having a hard time adjusting to the new flat collar. Amanda Wunder writes, the new flat collar that was supposed to replace the large ruff left Spanish men feeling vulnerable, ugly, and angry. The answer to this problem was the invention of the golilla. By March of that year, the king was spotted wearing the new fashion. The golilla was an undercollar made from stiffened paper and covered with fabric that covered the neck and allowed the valona to rise high around the neck. By using the golilla himself, the king helped popularize a style that quickly became a uniform for Spanish men, adopted first by his courtiers and then by commoners. Philip IV gave the example. By dressing with austerity and preferring severity over ornament, the king set a model of manhood based on the principles of religious modesty, moral, and duty. According to the color historian Michel Pastoureau, black was associated during this time period with the idea of seriousness and virtue. Until the end of the 17th century, this uniform of black clothes with white collar became the look of Spanish men, synonymous with their national identity and political affiliation. This is a good example of the use of fashion as a political instrument. Although this golilla gate was essentially at its core a domestic affair, it had international repercussions. The new look quickly became recognized by the rest of Europe as a symbol of Spanishness. Madrid in the beginning of the 17th century became a fashion center. Fashion and clothes were everywhere. The city was the capital of the Spanish Empire, and since its return from Valladolid in 1606, the site of the royal court. Because of the presence of the kings and their court, the necessity for a clothing industry in the city rose exponentially. Tailors, seamstresses, embroiderers, shoemakers, and fabric merchants were some of the many that were attracted to the capital. Iconographic sources leave us a testimony of the level of refinement and craftsmanship at the disposal of the rich and powerful. Inside palace halls, royals and nobles displayed the finest silks, the most luxurious embroideries, and the rarest of gems. But common people, living their lives in the hustle and bustle of the city, also had an appetite for fashion, and, if possible, for luxury. Under the archways of the Plaza Mayor, up and down the Paseo del Prado, or on the banks of the Manzanares. In these places, all walks of life came together to see and to be seen. It was in this effervescent environment that the Guardainfante came to be, but not without a great deal of controversy. Sometime in the middle of the 1630s, the Spanish farthingale, still worn by women, morphed into a new type of garment. Maybe it was the vision of the French actors on stage, as suggested by Carmen Berniche. Maybe it was something else. But the fact is that Spanish women started merging the hip-extending shape of the French farthingale with the hoops of the Spanish verdugado. By doing so, the Guardainfante was born. In a simplified way, this plus this equals this. All these paintings represent the same person in different stages of her life. This is Elisabeth of Bourbon, the first wife of Philip IV. The French princess turned Queen of Spain was one of the early champions of the Guardainfante. As Amanda Wunder points, Elisabeth of Bourbon wore different farthingales throughout her life, making her the perfect example to understand the path that led to the creation of the Guardainfante. In the first portrait, she is presented as a French princess, wearing the drum-shaped French farthingale, a low-cut bodice, and a Medici-style lace collar. All these different elements and the way that they were combined were the latest style in places like Paris, London, or Brussels. But when Elizabeth moved to Spain, she adopted the Spanish style, the conical shaped verdugado, the high rough color, and the overall stiff Spanish aesthetic. The second portrait represents her in a distant, sacred like way, powerful and untouchable. She's dressed with an almost military rigor. There is a great sense of authority and identity in this painting. The fabric of the dress is covered with the letter I, the initials of the Spanish version of her name, Isabel. So clothing helped her in her process of Hispanicization. The fact that she was able to adapt to the Spanish court helped her become one of the most influential people in the reign of her husband, a queen with true political agency. On the third portrait, we can see the evolution of the Spanish style, now with the use of the Guardainfante. The rough collar, outlawed for men but still accepted for women, is clearly on its way out, and the hairstyle is starting to mimic the shape of the skirt. The form of the skirt is becoming rounder and less conical. This is an early version of the Guardainfante. At first sight, it's not very different from the old Verdugado, but as the style grew in popularity, so did its size. The Guardainfante found its supporters and detractors amongst men and women, both national and foreign, but it is clear that the overwhelming majority of its critics were men. Wunder points to the earliest critique of the Guardainfante being related to its origins and name. In 1636, the jurist Alonso Carranza branded the new fashion as of French origin and therefore foreign. Carranza also claimed that the name Guardainfante resulted from the French Guardainfante, which translates roughly as baby keeper. With this, he associated the Guardainfante with the alleged practice of disguising illicit pregnancies with a farthingale. Although divorced from reality, as we will see, this type of critique became the foundation of all the attacks aimed at the Guardainfante. First of all, as we saw, the Guardainfante is a distinctively Spanish invention, but 17th century Spanish sources always categorize it as French. Spain and France were at war during this period. By making the Guardainfante French, that helped discredit the garment. Second, associating farthingales with hidden pregnancies was nothing new. More than 100 years before, when the first verdugados appeared in Spain, moralists did the same baseless accusation. In other words, you cannot hide a pregnancy with this stuff. It just makes no anatomic sense. Besides illicit pregnancies, members of the church also accused the Guardainfante of creating false ideals of beauty, like makeup and hairpieces. Not only was it a sin against the creation of God, men were being deceived. This is one of the strongest accusations against the Guardainfante, it being used by women to subvert gender expectations and defy male authority. Attacks came from everywhere, sometimes even with contradictory claims. If some saw the Guardainfante as a symbol of dishonest sexual practices by women and a disguise for pregnancies outside the institution of marriage, others accused it of being the cause of female infertility. Women wearing the Guardainfante were being chased and harassed in the streets, mocked relentlessly in theater plays, and preached at during Mass. So what did these women do? They kept wearing it. The war over the Guardainfante reached its most dramatic moment in April of 1639, with the issue of a royal law forbidding, amongst others, the use of the Guardainfante or any similar device by women except for prostitutes. Low-cut bodices were equally outlawed. A woman caught wearing a Guardainfante would be fined and have her hoopskirt confiscated. Tailors were also targeted. A second offense could lead to exile or even imprisonment. This ban proved successful in the months immediately after the law was made public, but it was received mostly with humor. After the summer, women went back to their Guardainfante and their low-cut bodices. But if the ban on the male ruff worked, why didn't it work for the Guardainfante? Well, Philip IV didn't seem very interested in outlawing the Guardainfante. After the initial pressure of different states of society, the king issued the ban of 1639. After that, he never showed any real interest in forbidding the use of the Guardainfante. Queen Elisabeth of Bourbon was one of the early adopters of the Guardainfante. The wives and daughters of Philip IV never stopped wearing it. There was simply no example coming from the royal family. On the contrary, the monarchy seemed to be a supporter of the very same thing that they were trying to outlaw. The most important role in the life of a queen was to produce an heir. By using the Guardainfante, a garment repeatedly associated with pregnancy, Spanish royal women were evidencing their fertility in the European political scene. Their fertility was the fertility and the political future of Spain. The fashion only became more and more popular, not only in Madrid, but in other cities of Spain, Portugal, Italy, and even in the New World. Now that we know the origins of the Guardainfante and how it gained its place in Spanish society, let's see how it impacted daily life. With a portrait of Ana de Velasco in Giron, I show you the overall aspect and silhouette of Spanish fashion in the beginning of the 17th century. In the painting, she's wearing a saya entera, a formal dress comprised of a doublet with a skirt with a train. Although it is spectacular, it doesn't represent what women wore on a daily basis. The saya entera, which was essentially an upper-class dress, was worn mostly on important religious holidays, ceremonies like weddings and receptions, as well as sitting for portraits. On a daily basis, affluent women, including the Queen, wore a simplified version of that. And we have an excellent example on this portrait of Isabel Clara Eugenia, the daughter of Philip II and the aunt of Philip IV. She's wearing a dress comprised of three pieces, a jubon, which is a doublet, a vesquinha, a petticoat, and a loose overgown called ropa. Naturally, as a princess, hers are made from the most luxurious fabrics like silk and fur, as well as embroidered with gold and pearls. This jubon or doublet from the National Costume Museum in Madrid is very similar to the one worn by the princess. It's made from silk and lined with linen. It's sleeveless, which probably meant it was used with detachable sleeves. It closes in the front with buttons that run from the collar to the waist. The waist ends in a very pronounced V and it's surrounded by tabs called faldillas. Now, let's see how fashion changed throughout time and with the adoption of the Guardainfante. Once again, María de la Encarnación is the perfect example. Because of her trial, we know that her signature style was, like this anonymous portrait by Diego Velázquez, a black petticoat worn over a large Guardainfante and a low-cut bodice. Maria's accessories were comprised of choker necklaces of pearls and coral, a fine silk mantle, and high platform shoes called chapines, decorated with silver studs. Women kept wearing the combination between jubon and vesquinha. The garments and the names are essentially the same, but their shape will change to accommodate the Guardainfante. Garments like the ropa fell out of fashion, mainly because it didn't fit with the wide horizontal line created by the Guardainfante. Because of this shift, it became acceptable for women to be seen in public wearing only the vesquinha and the jubon. The vesquinha, or petticoat, adapted the bell-like shape of the Guardainfante, growing in its size as the Guardainfante became wider over time. The pronounced V of the jubon became subtler, and the tabs grew into a peplum-like overskirt that accompanied the shape of the Guardainfante. Court portraits tend to be more modest when it comes to necklines, but we do know that women wore low-cut bodices, showing more or less skin. Until the 1650s, sleeves still maintained a hanging over sleeve reminiscent of the round sleeves of the previous century, but with time they disappear, becoming more influenced by French fashion. Necklines also became wider with time. With the arrival of Mariana of Austria, Philip IV's second wife, in 1649, the place of the Guardainfante in women's wardrobe became even more secure. Like her predecessor, the new queen became a trendsetter, ensuring the popularity of the hoopskirt and ushering in a softer, more feminine style, evidenced by the use of bows, ribbons, feathers, and bright colors. And women were eager to copy the queen. Amanda Wunder wrote, "While few, if any, of her subjects could afford the queen's crown jewels, many could emulate her style by wearing a Guardainfante. Whatever her natural shape, a woman who wore such hoopskirt could transform her figure to achieve this regal silhouette." One of the best ways to be informed about the latest fashions was an unexpected one. Every spring in Madrid, the procession of the Corpus Christi took place. It celebrated the victory of the church over evil via an allegorical parade called Tarasca, and it attracted large crowds to the city. Here we can see the Tarasca from 1667. On top of a papier-mâché dragon, a symbol of evil, stood the Gigantona, a female dummy that represented the whore of Babylon. This float was supposed to represent vice and sin, and for that reason the Gigantona was dressed and coiffed in the latest fashions as a form of critique and mockery of vanity and lust. But instead of being an example of what not to do, the Tarasca became a barometer of fashion. Women flocked to see it, to be informed of the latest styles for the spring, copying the Gigantona's hairstyles and dresses. And there were many occasions to show off their new wardrobes. On the west of Madrid runs the Manzanares River. Its shallow waters and green shores became a point of attraction to the inhabitants of Madrid, who found there a fresh refuge from the summer heat and a pleasant place to enjoy holidays. This anonymous painting, dated from the 1660s, depicts one of those holidays, more specifically the Day of St. John in early summer. This scene takes place right in front of the palace of the Marquis of Castel Rodrigo and right across from the Casa de Campo, a royal countryside villa belonging to the royal family. The presence of these two buildings lended even more prestige to the site, making it one of the most important social and cultural spots of the Spanish capital, a place to see and be seen. I really like this painting. I think it represents very well the vitality of the city and its dwellers. Most importantly, it shows that the Guardainfante was actually worn by women on the street. So you can see them going up and down the street, you can see them sitting down, having a picnic. So this is not a fashion that existed only on official paintings, but something that actually took place in the streets. Queen Mariana of Austria was not only copied in Spain, but also in foreign territories. Although at war with Spain after the restoration of the independence, Portugal also adopted the Guardainfante. In the famous portrait of Catherine of Braganza by Dirk Stoop, the Portuguese princess is represented wearing a black and silver dress over a Guardainfante. After her arrival in England to marry Charles II, Catherine, relentlessly criticized and mocked by the English, stopped wearing the hoopskirt and adopted the French style fashionable at her new court. In the Italian cities ruled by the Habsburgs, Spanish fashion was equally adopted. Wearing the Spanish style was a symbol of loyalty to the Catholic monarchs. Sometimes Italian ladies mix French and Spanish style like this one. She's clearly wearing a French style dress over a Guardainfante. But the Guardainfante was not only worn in Europe, it also set sail to the New World. There are extensive written and visual sources that prove the use of the Guardainfante in the territories ruled by Spain in the Americas. This biombo or windscreen presents a view of the palace of the Viceroy in Mexico City. We can see the austere facade of the palace of the Viceroy with his coat of arms over the door, and we can also see a carriage being pulled by black horses, possibly the carriage of the Viceroy. And in one of the corners, we can see a group of ladies promenading precisely with the Guardainfante. The popularity of the Guardainfante peaked in the second half of the reign of Philip IV, much because of the influence of his wife, Mariana of Austria, and his two surviving daughters, Maria Teresa and Margarita. This zenith in popularity of the Guardainfante coincided with one of the most prolific periods in the career of court painter Diego Velázquez. In fact, this group of women were often the subject of his paintings, having posed for him several times. Velázquez's most celebrated painting, Las Meninas, depicts precisely the young Infanta Margarita and her ladies-in-waiting, all wearing the Guardainfante. But the downfall of the Guardainfante started on the 17th of September 1665, because on that day, Philip IV died. With the death of her husband, Mariana of Austria became a widow. A respectable widow of the 17th century, and especially a widow in the position of the queen, was expected to follow some specific rules of behavior, including their way of dressing. Mariana had to part ways with her colorful dresses, feathers, and jewels, as well as her Guardainfante. Mariana adopted the traditional widow's weeds of Iberia, the mongil. She wore it for the rest of her life. But don't feel bad for her. This uniform of black and white was a key element for Mariana's gain of real political power as the regent of the Spanish Empire during the minority of her son, Charles II. Dressed as a widow, she entered her girl boss era. After Mariana of Austria became a widow, Amanda Wunder talks about a certain lack of cohesion in Spanish fashion. The lack of a royal trendsetter led to the emergence of ephemeral fashion trends with no direction. The Guardainfante kept being worn at court, and it's precisely during this time that it reached its maximum size, as exemplified by the portrait of the Countess of Monterrey by Carreño de Miranda. By the late 1670s, the Guardainfante was definitely out of style, but it was still mandatory to be used at court. It's important not to forget that Mariana of Austria, based on her position as Dowager Queen and Regent, maintained a great influence over court life. But don't think that Spanish women gave up on their farthingales just yet. The sacristan replaced the Guardainfante, as evidenced in the portraits of the new queen, Maria Louisa of Orléans. During the reign of her husband, Charles II, Spanish fashion maintained its originality while incorporating new elements imported from France. It's interesting to compare a jubon dated from this period and the one that I showed you previously and see how Spanish fashion changed throughout the 17th century. Fashion had moved on. After the death of Charles II, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, a new dynasty came to power. Philip of Bourbon became Philip V of Spain in 1700 and married Maria Luisa Gabriela of Savoy the following year. As a sign of respect for the traditions of the Spanish court, the new queen wore a Guardainfante on her wedding day. But soon after, the Guardainfante, a relic of the past, was out for good. So, what happened to Maria de la Encarnacion and her Guardainfante? Well, after her trial, Maria was exiled from Madrid. 10 years later, she was found again in the nets of the Inquisition. And guess what? She was still wearing her Guardainfante. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I certainly had a lot of fun putting it together. So I will see you on the next one.